I asked listeners the following question. What do you want the candidates to talk about as they campaign for your vote? So every question that I'll be asking is based on their responses. Most of our respondents reflected what we've also been seeing in opinion polls, which is they really want you to talk about your plans on homelessness. So my first question to you is, what is your specific plan to address encampments in city parks, sidewalks, and other public spaces, and how is that different from what's been done before?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that question. And I think that this is the critical issue facing the next mayor and our city. And I do believe that together we can solve and end the homelessness crisis in our city. For me, I think it's really important to rapidly, within the first 100 days of my administration, have meaningful progress on making sure that we're getting the unmet needs of our unhoused neighbors met. And as it relates specifically to people who are currently living outside and in our parks and in our public parkways, for me, the specific plan has to be really focused on working together with community service providers and with our housing providers to quickly create an individual service plan for each of the individuals that are currently living outside and work with those partners in housing and human services settings to match them immediately and very quickly again to a housing and a shelter option that is safer and more appropriate for meeting their basic needs. So again, we're not going to be able to solve entirely the issue in the first 100 days, but I'm committed to urgently and quickly making a meaningful difference for those who are currently homeless in the first 100 days by focusing on those sort of short-term, rapid rehousing options.
Well, first of all, thank all of you for putting on this forum, and I appreciate how you presented the question, because when I describe in detail the approach that we will use, some people are quick to criticize by saying that we're trying to criminalize poverty and all the things we absolutely will not do. So I guess the first statement I'd make is, when we looked at this while I was on the council, we really tried to implement best practices and find the best consultants to figure out what made sense. And so when we had developed the concept of housing first, when we developed the concept of aggressive individualized case management, looking at the face of homelessness, knowing that there are many roads to that, when we developed a regional approach, it didn't just come out of thin air. It came from much dialogue and much research, figuring out how the best way will be to approach this issue. And so I think we have all of the policies, the right policies in place. I think when COVID had come so aggressively, sort of in a way that paralyzed many of our activities, that could have been the best time to really double down on our strategic planning, our site planning, our production of transitional housing, i.e. tiny homes. We could have really, rather than do nothing, which to a large extent, I think, paralyzed many people in the city hall, that we could have aggressively thought about what we could have done. And so to answer your question directly, I think we need to, again, do sort of two things. One is move people into housing. Simply said, that we can produce housing. For example, I visited one tiny home production facility where they can make 3 to 4 homes a week for $4,000. And while that is a 6-month transitional piece, when you get funds, federal funds, for example, in the tune of $116 million, and you're still spending $200 million from your general subfund, the answers are there on how to implement. And I think what will be new under my administration is actually doing the work. That the system is broke between the executive and the city council and the city attorney's office, this sort of, and the department heads, sort of think of it as a box, if you will, that the machine is not working. The individualized case management is not occurring. When they cleaned City Hall Park, as an example, that was a result of public protests. And so you see that parks can be cleaned up and people can be housed when you have the political will. And so under my approach, we're not going to make any excuses. We are going to implement the policies that are on the books, use the available funds that are there. And I think what is different is we will find an entry point for everyone in this city. That's the low-hanging fruit. We have 750,000 people in this city. We have very wealthy and successful corporations in this city. And everywhere I go, they ask the same question, what can I do? And the city council and the mayor and the city bureaucracy have not figured out how to tap into the talent of this city. That's what we will do. That's what I will do. And so all hands on deck. That I believe in the compassion of the city. I believe in the success of some of the businesses around here and their corporate social responsibility goals. And I believe that we can get this done. So we don't have that kind of leadership coming out of City Hall. You have people blaming each other, and that'll just stop under my leadership.
Critics of your plan say that that portion of your plan that involves removing homeless encampments through sweeps, as you know, the criticism is that it essentially moves vulnerable homeless people from place to place, and that further disrupts people's lives that are already hard enough. So what's your response to that criticism?
So first of all, I was born and raised in the city, as people probably have heard by now, and I have a demonstrated track record, even before I was on the council, of helping people. My entire life as a lawyer, as a student in college, as a high school student tutoring boys and girls at the Rotary Boys and Girls Club. And that's in my DNA in terms of that kind of public service. So we're not criminalizing those that need help. We are acting as we should. When I passed the human rights legislation declaring Seattle a human rights city under the Declaration of Human Rights, when we started implementing the regional housing approach, we always led with compassion. So we're not moving a person from one place to another. That we've seen time and time again, when the city acts, things get done. And, I saw in one debate that my opponent put a lot of blame on Mayor Durkin. I don't do that because, number one, she's not there to defend herself, and I don't think the people of Seattle want to point the finger at the council or the mayor, the city attorney. I think they want the whole operation to work smoothly and efficiently and effectively. So critics of my plan I would ask them to look at my record, and they know that my wife, who is a former CEO and president of United Way, and they know the work we've done in philanthropic communities, that there's nothing in our life that says we will criminalize poverty and simply move a homeless person from one area to another. That what I bring is a whole new narrative and a whole new sense of urgency. And we don't see that right now. A lot of the ideas advanced by my opponent, they can do now. If the total elimination of single family zoning is something that she believes can be done, they could do that now. If there are many ideas that they are advancing that they can do now. I want to act now, and that does not mean we'll criminalize poverty.
Some of the voters that I've interviewed agree with you on sweeps. They don't work. They don't solve homelessness. But at the same time, some of these same voters say, look, some of these locations are less compatible with homeless encampments than others, public spaces behind elementary schools or near children's spray parks, for example. So what do you say to those voters?
I say that we have a lot of agreement in that space. Listen, frankly, I think it's unacceptable for us to live in a city with such great prosperity and have people experiencing such horrific conditions by having to survive outside during extreme weather events and again, not having their basic needs met. And so I think most voters in the city of Seattle agree that forcibly removing people from one place to another place of the city, which is how the city has currently led on the issue of trying to address homelessness, is shifting the problem around, is not what people want to see. We want to see people effectively housed. We want to see people transitioned out out of unsafe, inappropriate places to safer, more appropriate places. And again, that's going to take that intensive community outreach by our subject matter experts in this area, as well as quickly and, in such a highly collaborative way, working with our housing providers and our shelter providers to open up spaces and to set up new spaces to quickly bring people inside. And of course, my plan to sort of do that assessment from a people-centered focus is likely going to be in need of some prioritization, right? So where are the geographic areas that are really creating significant concern that require us to engage in that individual service plan as sort of a top tier priority and begin the process of transitioning those folks.
What happens under your plan if people refuse services who are in those spaces? Again, that voters agree with you on sweeps. Generally speaking, they don't solve the problem. You're just moving folks around, having they're going to lose their stuff. There are all kinds of problems with it. But that some locations are less compatible with encampments than others. How do you address that specific concern? Acknowledging that you're not going to solve the problem within the first 100 days.
I think, my conversation with, again, service providers in this space who have spent decades working on addressing these needs. What I've heard from them is that there is an opportunity to persuade folks to move to a more compatible area that is not, a school or a dangerous part of the city. That takes a little bit of time. It takes on average about 8 contacts from a community, service provider to even open up somebody's mind to believe that the offer of housing or services is real and authentic. And so that community outreach and engagement, that's why it's so important for us to continue to invest in that part of the spectrum and to do that work now. And continue to have our service providers do that community outreach work will make it easier once I become the next mayor to really sort of get to that next step of the equation, which is to identify immediately spots that are currently available and stand up, implement millions of dollars that we have on the table now to scale up our emergency response system to bring people inside.
Okay, but if they refuse services, what happens?
If they refuse services, and again, we're talking about a very small population of those experiencing homelessness, those individuals who refuse services for their own reasons are a very small percentage of the overall homeless population. Now, I think in those instances, we would work closely with our community outreach engagement specialists to help identify where a more compatible place is that doesn't cause a significant risk to either the unhoused individual or neighbors in the area.
So affordable housing in Seattle is quite complicated. It does include, the need to have income requirements. There are credit history checks, there are rental history checks, and quite often that still poses a barrier to Black and Brown people. I saw that your recent plan addresses this building of more homes, but how does your plan address the fact that there are still barriers to a significant amount of the population? It's not just that there aren't enough houses.
Thank you. I appreciate that. No, I think that I think it is a both and I think that's sort of inherent in your question. And so there's no doubt that there are additional barriers to housing. And as the next mayor, I would continue to prioritize the need for the state of Washington to address these laws that create significant barriers to entry and to transition from one housing space to another. That's another issue that I hear from a lot of folks, is that it's cheaper for them to continue to stay in substandard housing or in the expensive housing that they're in because it's just too expensive for them to leave. And that is contributed in large part on because of some of the barriers that you've identified around credit checks and around exorbitant amount of dollars that people have to pay to get into housing in the first place. my plan really does focus on creating housing infrastructure that is inherently more affordable, which I really strongly believe is an important strategy to creating access and housing choice for our Black and Brown neighbors. But I also think that those systemic issues at the state need to be tackled head on. And the next mayor, who is the chief lobbyist on behalf of the city and the people of this city, has an important role to play in Olympia to make the case for why these law changes to our landlord tenant laws is so critically important to preventing people from becoming homelessness and to allow people to address their housing instability. And, I'm proud to be endorsed in this race by Representative Nicole Macri in the 43rd Legislative District, who is considered one of the state's experts in the area of addressing, the lack of access to housing and to affordable housing in particular for many tenants across the state, including here in the city of Seattle, and would work closely with her to make sure that she has all the support she needs from the city of Seattle to really beat that drum in Olympia, get these laws changed so that we have the ability at the city to be nimble with our own programs, with our own laws, to be able to create those pathways to housing. I'll just end by saying that I do want to live in a city where we are inclusive. I want to live in a city where this housing options aren't just available to the wealthy. I don't want to live in a city where it's illegal to build apartments, duplexes, and other forms of housing in certain parts of the city. And so I also want to live in a city where Black and Brown people have an opportunity to build wealth. And we do that by owning a home, whether it's a condo or something else. And so I do want to put us on a path towards creating those, for example, lease to home ownership opportunities for our low-income Brown and Black communities, and also increasing the amount that we are making available for our low-income residents to actually be able to put a down payment and buy a home as sort of a long-term solution towards creating both wealth and more stable housing for those communities.
Yeah. So again, in the last 5 to 7 years, we've really tried to be granular in looking at the impediments, and from what was also sort of a unfortunate but very real impediment was racism. That, as you may recall, through our Office of Civil Rights, we looked at some renters, as an example, were quoted, who were African American, were quoted higher rates and weren't told about special move-in specials as non-African Americans. And so all of those impediments that we will certainly examine. One of the challenges we have in the city of Seattle that we will rectify through a design change is housing is sort of governed by several policies in the city. It could be governed through the Office of Housing. It could be governed through some of it through HSD. Some of it's governed through the zoning, the different zoning. They've called different names now. The zoning departments in the city. I don't like the word czar, but it's the only name that has come up is a housing czar, if you will, within the city. And so what we're going to try to look at is one centralized unit that helps coordinate all of the issues associated with housing, whether it's the permit regulatory processing, the zoning processing, the federal fund, applying for federal funds and seizing federal and state funds, helping with the housing levy as we go into the next housing levy discussions. So rather than have it in several different departments, we're looking at whether we centralize it. And by centralizing it, we can do that deep dive into all of those impediments that people are feeling on the grassroots level. Because right now, they may even go to a utility for utility assistance, as an example. So we're looking at some design models on how we achieve that, because we think the city is fragmented in their housing approach.
Mayor Jenny Durkan has extended the city's eviction moratorium out to January 15th, which means she's not really going to have to deal with it, and the next mayor is, potentially you. There's an estimated 60,000 Seattle area renters who have some form of renter debt at this point. On the other hand, you also have landlords, many of them small, who are stretched a little thin. So I'm curious if and when you come into office, what exactly your approach to the eviction ban is going to be.
So number one is I have to look at the data. And yes, emergency rental assistance, I'm a strong believer in that. There's unequivocal that emergency rental assistance needs to be provided. I also believe that the small landlord, the person that owns one unit or two units that have done this for retirement income, who still have insurance to pay and taxes to pay, et cetera, and a mortgage to carry in many cases, that their voice is not heard nearly as loudly as it should be in City Hall. So as I approach rental assistance and the eviction moratorium, I have to have them at the table. And I can't issue a broad statement and say how that will look, because they too, at some point, they too are in need. And because what will happen is if they have no other choices, that they will likely sell their house. And now once again, we have another renter that is out of a house, out of a place to stay. So I have to work with the small landlords as well to make sure their voice is heard at the table. So we will look at the math. We'll look at who's hurting out there in the communities in terms of the renters and the small landlords, and come up with smart policies.
Yeah, well, I think that the reality around us being out of this pandemic by January 22 is pretty low. And so I think there would be, a legitimate reason to look at extending that eviction moratorium. But that also has to be done in conjunction with continuing to identify resources available for tenant rental assistance. And there is also an opportunity to look at how we can allocate additional funding for landlords who are also struggling to make their mortgage at the end of the month. So we have dollars available for both, and we need to make sure that we are continuing to increase the number of dollars that we have available to both landlords and tenants who are dealing with back rent or back mortgage. And I think, again, this is an area where we need both the federal and the state government to step into to really truly meet the need. We can meet some of the need with our city resources, but we are going to have to look to the state and the federal government, short of an immediate revenue option for this space to help us out.
I was just reading that the cost of housing folks, which we're doing, but in small numbers, is around $300,000 per unit. And there are estimated to be around 11,000 people in Seattle facing homelessness. So if my math's right, just to house everybody who's currently homeless in Seattle would cost billions of dollars. We don't really hear this very often. People seem to kind of shy away from the real numbers. And that's just housing. And we're not talking about the next 11,000 people who are in precarious situations right now due to the high cost of living and COVID and everything else. But we're currently spending around $160 million, not billions. The mayor's budget, I think, calls for $200 million or something like that. So what's the total price tag, really, of your plan to address homelessness, so voters can have a sense of what we're actually talking about if we want to solve these problems, both for homeless people and for these public spaces that we've been talking about?
Great question. I do think that the price tag is rather significant because the need is so significant. But I think the reports that I have seen, particularly around the needs of housing for the extremely low income population, these are the people who make nothing in monthly income to a few $100s a month. The housing needs for those folks in the region, in the Seattle King County region, is estimated to be about $1 billion worth of a need for additional affordable housing for those populations. So, I think really, I think the price tag could be in the billions for addressing the needs of those who are currently unhoused, but also as a prevention mechanism. But I also want to emphasize that this is not an issue that we can go alone on. There will be revenue that we will need to put in as a city of Seattle. But I think I'm also looking to my relationships with our state partners, with our county partners, and with our federal partners to continue to unlock those really important dollars, those additional resources that we're going to need to sort of pull together an entire financing plan to make sure that we have the dollars that we need to both build the housing that we currently need, but also continue to address the rising cost of living in our city that is being driven by our private market. And so there's a lot of different tools available to the next mayor to really, begin to pull together those resources that are going to be necessary to meet the scale of the need. But we're gonna work together quickly and urgently in the first 100 days of my administration to really identify where those levers exist and how we can identify those pots of dollars immediately to scale up the housing investments that we need, both in the short term and the long term.
We keep hearing about the new regional housing authority, and I don't really have an image yet of how that's going to look and work here. So when you talk about, the city's approach to addressing homelessness and to finding new money to address it, is that going to constrain anything that we can do, or how is that going to look here?
Yeah, the Regional Homelessness Authority is no, that's okay. We there's so many acronyms in this space, but the Regional Homelessness Authority, which is an entity that I currently sit on as a city council member, and the next mayor also participates on the governing committee, and it is going to be a key strategy for us to addressing the unmet needs of our unhoused neighbors as a region. The reality is that King County and the city of Seattle will continue to bear the financial responsibility of funding that Regional Homelessness Authority this fall. I'll be at the table in my current capacity talking about what the resources should be that we should allocate as a city. What portion should we bear the burden of in that process? Unfortunately, our suburban city partners who are part of our part of the authority are not at this point considering or willing to put in additional resources to address the needs related to suburban cities. And I hope that that's something we can change in the future. But I think it's really going to shift the focus from having politicians making a lot of these challenging decisions about siting shelters, about how many shelters we should have, and where people can use things like vouchers or purchase hotels. And I think that coordination is going to be really important. The city of Seattle, however, regardless of the Regional Homelessness Authority, will still be left responsible for addressing individuals who are living in our public spaces, because we're responsible for managing our public land. But having the Regional Homelessness Authority in place is really, I believe, going to increase the capacity of our emergency response system in a way that allows us to access additional meaningful interventions for people who are experiencing homelessness that will make it much easier for people to say yes to the thing that we're offering them and to effectively transition them inside.
Your homelessness plan / housing plan proposes to build about 2,000 units within a year. I'm curious about how realistic that is. Criticism is that Seattle has really only ever built 600 in a year previously. Generally, construction projects take a little bit of time. So how exactly do you physically plan on making that happen?
Well, it will be done. I mean, I'm not going to pull out a hammer and nail and show you how quickly they can be built. But that is actually, I think, a fairly modest goal. And at some point, it's just been my life philosophy. You put a stake in the ground and you say it's going to get done, and you get it done. So we will work around the clock. We will invest. We will produce. And just to be very clear that I have never said I am against purchasing hotels and purchasing other types of fixes to house people. I'm for that as well. I looked at the finances or the sustainability of the hotel arrangements. That gets a little costly. And so critics could say that that's an aggressive goal, but I think it's a realistic goal. And I've talked to too many people in the building and housing industry that once we loosen some of our regulatory standards that the city could control, once we make sure we have, in many cases, volunteers. An example would be the one small nonprofit with one paid employee and maybe a crew of 12 volunteers with no carpentry skills using what's called a jigsaw approach. They could produce 4 a week, just part-time. So it can be done. Should we put our foot on the accelerator and get it produced? You know, in strategy and in business, we talk about delay tactics. We talk about setting a goal and meeting it. That's the kind of attitude I think we have to have. And so any critics, I would just tell them to sort of move out of the way, and we'll make sure the right people are doing the work, and we'll get them produced.
Speaking of costly, is there a more firm price tag on this? You previously proposed taking $18 million from the general fund, potentially $116 million from the American Rescue Plan. That's if that gets approved. There's been consultants out there, I'm going to cite McKinsey & Company, for example, that say that the price tag on this kind of plan is a lot higher than what you've spoken about in these millions. So do you have a more firm price tag? And if so, where specifically is this money coming from?
First of all, if you read the McKinsey report, and I assume many people have, and you look at what we're spending now, we are already spending that $1 billion number in terms of housing, affordability, and homelessness issues. And the breakdown will go something like this. There's about 280 million in state and federal funds. You look at Seattle Housing Authority, you look at the 200 million that the city spends, you look at United Way and other philanthropic organizations, you look at what the county is spending. That will total about $1 billion. The problem is that we cannot outpace our growth. I mean, if you look at 1990 numbers, we had 520,000 people here. 1980, we had less than 500,000, and the 460,000. We're at 750,000 people now, and a lot of these are high wage earners. So we have become quickly a very wealthy city. And so even though we spend $1 billion in affordability, the growth has outpaced us. So under my approach, we will continue to double down on all of those funds. But the fact of the matter is we are now talking about, there's sort of two things going on here in this discussion. One are the unhoused living in parks and on sidewalks. And when I said we can produce to make sure that they have warm water, heat, and they get wraparound services. The whole housing affordability issue for the teacher, the barista, the nonprofit worker, the student, that's a whole nother ball game. And so that's where you are looking at $1 billion plus investment. So you look at and I'll commend the council on this. For decades, we've looked at this issue. We've hired the best of the best consultants to figure out the long-term plan. That was the hall of work. The Housing Affordability and Livability Advisory Committee with 65 recommendations, from incentive zoning to a commercial linkage fee to lowering restrictions for people who are formerly incarcerated, the Seattle Housing Levy. All of these 65 tools are what we will use in our toolbox. And so, but we have to be sober about this, that our city has become wealthier in terms of the people who've come here, many of whom have priced out lower income people. So we will continue to do the hard work, implement best practices, build where it makes sense. We have zoning capacity for literally hundreds of thousands of units. And so the city has to get out of its way sometimes for this, from a regulatory standpoint, to allow this kind of production. And that's what we plan on doing.
This is a question from a listener. It's based on feedback from a listener, actually. So even as the city works to solve homelessness, if you just walk around, I think most people can see that this is only worsening, possibly worsening through the pandemic as well. What do you say to people who have already given up hope that this city can even solve this issue at this point?
I'd say that person, let's have coffee. And I literally mean that. I mean, I'm all over the city, and I tell people that that we have to believe in the goodness of this city and that we can collectively solve this. Now, you may say, Bruce, you're being a little Pollyannic in your approach or a little too lofty in your goals. I've spent a lifetime trying to pull out the best in people, and that's why I'm energized. That's why I'm running. What people don't realize is, what can they do? They're asking, what can they do? Can they give $5? Can they give $100? Can they give the shirt off their back? What can they do? And so we have to, again, find an entry point for everyone to have hope. And I'll tell you that our strategy just on homelessness, the brick and mortar piece, quite candidly, that's the easiest piece. Just building and getting people out of our playgrounds, off of our sidewalks. That's not the hard piece. What I'm looking at is the 5, 10, 15-year picture as well. So our investments in 0 to 4 in terms of brain development, those are going to be critical. And we will make sure that we fund that and make sure that we are instituting best practices for early brain development in high school and middle school. The predictors of homelessness, or the predictors of people who may have all of their safeguards fall down in their life, there are triggers and there are predictors. And so we will look at what's occurring at young people. That's why I was the first person to put in money through the 13th year to make sure that many young people coming out of high school could get one free school year in the college such that they could find their path to optimization. We will continue with that work. I'm creating a Seattle Job Center where people will say to themselves, well, I can't develop code. I'm not very strong in math, I don't think. Well, they could take remedial math, number one, but number two, they could tap into whatever gifts they have. We have apprenticeships that pay 6-figure salaries that people don't even know about. We're going to make it easier for employees to find jobs and for employers to find employees. And all of the grants and the training will be available. That is an economic generator that we will build right within the city. So what we're going to look at is the full pathway, the full continuum of people. And then we're going to work with the small and large employers because we want to employ from within this city. We have to realize something. We are a wealthy city and a wealthy county. Very successful. We have it all. Port, maritime, industry, high-tech, biotech, great university systems. We have a good hand here. We should not live like this. And so this energy that you hear from me is kind of energy you're going to see in City Hall. I talk about jobs. You know, there's a book called The Coming Jobs War, and there will be winners and losers in terms of who could keep and retain jobs in a city. And we will win because we have it all here. We have the industries that we can build upon, and I want the people here to be the beneficiaries of that.
Failure is not an option here. And for me, as a candidate in this race, and I really want to communicate to folks that failure is absolutely not an option. It is incumbent upon us to really take this urgently and to address it as the crisis it is. We just finished, dealing really well as a city, responding to the pandemic by quickly and nimbly using our city resources to set up mass vaccination sites, the largest mass vaccination site in the nation, to get people vaccinated, to get people tested. We can and should replicate that emergency response model to address the needs of people who are unhoused. That is the kind of in-depth, coordinated logistical operation that is going to have to come to bear if we are truly serious about responding to this as a crisis. And, as the next mayor of the city, that is how I would approach this issue, again, within those first 100 days, to really show people in the city that the city is capable of doing this and that we have a moral imperative to address it with that level of urgency and with those scale of resources to once and for all bring people inside humanely and quickly.